So because it's taking so long for me to actually edit and create the best list of 2019, I figure it's a good opportunity right now to talk about films I saw in January and February this past year. Starting off in January, I only saw 3 films, and we're going to zip on past them pretty quick. The first one is Bad Boys for Life. I'm honestly surprised that this film wasn't done sooner. The risk that comes with reviving a franchise years later is that you have to pick and choose what you can do story-wise that will either bring in or even alienate the audience that is familiar with the IP. Fortunately, the bond between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence is still pretty strong, and the violence, well, is really violent, and oddly shocking in some cases. The cinematography is reminiscent of the original films, even though Michael Bay isn't directing this time around, but I would be lying if I didn't say that there was something missing here. Even a friend I went to the movie with said it just didn't really live up to the original 2 films. I think that is particularly because Bay wasn't directing this time around. And the film goes to prove that even with a villain that has more characterization than the other film's antagonists, replicating the look of the previous films, it still has flaws. Mainly, it's all in the edit. There was just so many sequences in this film that just felt like padding, like a lot of B-roll shots of Miami. But there was potential here to make it fine-tuned. The second film I saw in January of 2020 was Miss Americana, a Taylor Swift documentary. To be quite honest here, I'm not enough of a fan of Taylor Swift to really get the effect that fans of her library of work can automatically feel. And this documentary, while informative of why and how she operates as a person was interesting, I found the entire thing kind of blah. It's just not interesting enough to talk about in depth. It's shot and edited well, but the thing that sours it a bit for me is that at the time of the film's release on Netflix, Swift released an album that tied into the film itself, leaving the film as a piece of promotional material for Swift's music. It's not a bad film really, but it just isn't for me. And the last film of January 2020 that I saw was Gretel and Hansel. This is quite possibly the oddest film to release in January. And yes, certainly January is usually a time when bad shovelware horror films get released. Gretel and Hansel, while it has plenty of flaws, is still an interesting film to watch even as a first-time viewer. It's shot like an A24 film, even though it isn't an A24 release. I think for me, the cinematography, production design, and overall sense of disorientation helps the film out a lot. But the biggest flaw is just how slow the film really is. I am all for slow-burning films if it's done purposefully. Alice Kriege's performance as the witch is suitably creepy, but the film is bogged down by the narration. A lot of it is just explaining what is happening on screen, and it overall doesn't serve a purpose other than to explain what is happening on screen. This is actually becoming one of my biggest writing gripes this year, and I wish filmmakers would just stop using it as a crutch. Trust your actors more. Trust your directors more. And then we get to February, which has a lot more releases that I could talk about. First up on Disney Plus is Timmy Failure, Mistakes Were Made. The first film released on Disney Plus in 2020, and I thought it was a really cute, lovable film. I love how the film subtly hints as to why he imagines the polar bear without putting too much emphasis on it. It is a really cute little family film, which is set in my state, by the way. It almost reminds me a bit of Diary of a Wimpy Kid's tone at times when it comes to its sense of humor. But all I can say is that this film perfectly embodies the quote-unquote weirdness that keeps Portland itself weird. Next, I saw Birds of Prey and the Fantabulous Emancipation of One Harley Quinn. I found this film to be entertaining. There are things I disagree with in the film, like some of the editing choices are similar to Suicide Squad, some character stuff that gets tainted, and the constant going back and forth in time hinders the flow a little bit, but overall I'd still recommend the film. It is a film that is purely a female film. The action isn't half bad either, with the amusement mile fight being a highlight of the film itself. But I gotta say that Ewan McGregor made my day. He just chews up the scenery like a corny and threatening villain. Birds of Prey is worth it if you can get past some of the issues it has. And then the next one that released the following week was Sonic the Hedgehog. I'm gonna say something controversial, but this isn't the best video game movie. Just because Sonic's design is much more faithful this time around and the animators had to work harder than ever before, even before being shut down after the redesign because Paramount doesn't know shit about Sonic, that doesn't change the core issues with the film. It does a lot of the typical things a bad family film does, and most of that stuff is in its first 2 acts of the film. Once we hit the 3rd act, it definitely does get a little better. If it wasn't for Ben Schwartz's voice performance or Jim Carrey's neurotic take on Dr. Robotnik, I don't see this film being anywhere near as successful. I do find it enjoyable though, despite my gripes with how generic parts of the storyline were. And of course, just like every year, Blumhouse decides to give a really shitty film a chance at the box office with Fantasy Island. Here we are again, Blumhouse. You allow the same team from the horrible Truth or Dare to make this film, with twice the budget, and all I gotta say is that this film is just terrible. There are even comparisons I can make between these 2 films, Truth or Dare and Fantasy Island, like the fact that both of these movies blatantly disregard their own rules that they set up, to the bad acting and the bad dialogue. But where I say that this film is a smidge better than Truth or Dare is that for some characters they get some decent moments, like with the mother in this film who wished she had a family of her own. Parts of this story were kind of interesting, but that isn't much compared to a lot of the bad that this film has. My fantasy, of course, would be that Blumhouse wouldn't make so many bad films. The next film after that I saw was The Call of the Wild. Okay, let's get the joke out of the way. Look how humans are playing dogs now. Isn't that funny? Now that joke is done. I honestly think this movie was kinda alright. The environments here are beautiful at times, but at other times, I could tell that there were green screens there. But this film has 2 main issues. One is the overuse of CG. Not just in the main dog, which I would have been fine with if it was the only character that was CG, but no, every single animal in this film was CG, except for one dead fish, which is just hilarious. This is one point that Chris Stuckman made in his review of the film. When there is nothing real really to attach to, the emotional levels of the scenes are low. For example, there's a confrontation with a bear that happens in the film, and because none of it is real, there is a lot of disconnect. Togo is an excellent example of mixing CG and real dogs. Obviously there are things in Call of the Wild that a dog couldn't do, but what's the real problem with using a real dog for sitting down shots, or delivering items, or even to run around a bit? But the second issue I have is the same issue I had with Gretel and Hansel, and that was the narration. So many times in this film, there is expositional narration that just describes what is happening. Films are visual mediums, guys. The use of narration here feels like it's trying to appeal to people who are always on their phones, and it just makes it all the more worse. The next film I saw was Superman Red Sun, the animated adaptation of the classic comic of the same name, and I'm going to be clear here and say I have yet really to read this story. I will at some point, but for now my opinion on the adaptation is that it's fairly enjoyable. The voice acting here is good, with Jason Isaacs once again voicing Superman, only this time he is Russian. I like how Superman in this film is given a different way of saving quote-unquote the world by being a leader of a country, and the film overall shows the progression of time in the Cold War that Superman takes over the USSR and tries to help his country and eventually the world. It is clear from the characterization and motivations of this version that makes this version distinct from the classic Red and Blue Boy Scout. I found the whole thing fun and enjoyable from start to finish, with some moral gray areas that are pretty interesting to think about, and I will be finding a place for this film in my library when it comes out on 4K later. The next movie I saw was Pokemon Mewtwo Strikes Back Evolution. I've made it apparent in the past that I am a pretty big fan of Pokemon. Like most nerds out there, I watched the anime, played the video games, and competed in the TCG. For those who don't know, that's a trading card game. But what was unexpected was how the Pokemon Company decided to work with Netflix to readapt their first movie from 1998 into a fully textured, computer-generated animated film with small changes. Some voice actors here are veterans of the series, and some aren't. I will commend Netflix and the Pokemon Company's decision to make it CG animated, as it allows for more expressive movements, dynamic lighting, and texturing, all while Disney themselves keeps making shitty quote-unquote live-action remakes. Granted, I in no way endorse more remakes of Pokemon's films. This was kind of just a fun little diversion, if not a flawed one. I am familiar with the original version of this film, and some scenes are played better in the original, like the destruction of the lab is more violent in the original, with the whole thing being kinda terrifying. Mewtwo's introduction to Ash is played a bit better in the original, but gives a better explanation of its motivations in the remake. But overall, this adaptation is a near waste of time. It does nothing exactly new that compares or even comments or even improves upon the original film. It's overall kind of a meh experience. The Invisible Man is one of the best films of the year so far. Leigh Whannell has more than proved himself over the years as an effective director, working primarily with low-budget films. Saw was the breakout hit for him as a writer and actor, and over the time that he's been around, he did Insidious, and more recently Upgrade, which landed him on my 2018 list. What is especially impressive with the film is how the film reinvents the wheel, as it were. The original film from the 1930s was more like a film where a guy grows mad with power and sees himself as a god, and all because people are suspicious of a disguise, and I mean, it's pretty generic stuff. It didn't have much horror to the piece, but the original film pushed the boundary of visual effects at the time. What this film manages to do is tap into the fear of the after effects of trauma from abusive relationships and failed relationships. The direction, the script, and the acting in this film works really well. And Elizabeth Moss, unsurprisingly, gives a really good performance here as well. And, as expected, it looks really good for its $7 million price tag. I'm serious, $7 million. I actually wouldn't mind more reimaginings from Lee or Blumhouse on the Universal Monsters series in the future if they are actually this good. And the last film I saw of February 2020 was Guns Akimbo. I'm not gonna lie, the idea of Harry Potter suddenly waking up to guns bolted to his hands is kind of a hilarious idea. Regardless, I think Guns Akimbo has some good things going into it. The film's message of being aware of how anonymity might get you in trouble in the social media sphere is a decent-ish message to send out. The violence is suitably over the top and can lead into some fun bits of comedy, but not all the comedy is good in the film, with some jokes becoming a bit stale over time. The cinematography here was good with some fun color grading. Unfortunately, this film doesn't have a lot of rewatch value to it. I'd actually recommend the film still, even if it only works once for me. And that is all I saw in January and February of 2020. And hopefully the next video I release is the best films of 2019. And oh boy, that one's going to be a little bit longer of a video than I anticipated. So, here's to you. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, and also hit that bell for notifications. And I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.